When widowed handyman Eli Turner married Harper Quinn out of desperation, he thought he was getting a roof over his daughter's head and help with crushing medical bills. Harper thought she was getting strong hands to fix her crumbling Victorian boarding house before the bank took it away. Neither expected to find a weathered strongbox hidden behind rotting wallpaper, containing century-old ledgers that revealed a staggering secret. Harper's grandmother had hidden a $300 million trust fund meant to save their small town during the Great Depression. But powerful forces have spent decades keeping that money buried, and they'll stop at nothing to claim it for themselves. Now this unlikely couple must decode mysterious letters, solve ancestral riddles, and unlock a final secret hidden in the town's clock tower. But can they crack the code before the foreclosure auction destroys everything they've built? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun filtered through the dust-laden windows of the Quinn Victorian, casting long shadows across the faded hardwood floors that had seen better decades. Eli Turner knelt beside his weathered leather toolbox, the brass clasps worn smooth by 30 years of honest work, and surveyed the electrical mess that snaked through the walls like arteries in a dying patient. The house groaned around him, settling into its bones with the weight of neglect and time. The main panels from 1962, he called to Harper, who stood in the doorway with 2 steaming cups of coffee. Surprised, this place hasn't burned down yet. Harper Quinn possessed the kind of beauty that came from strength rather than youth-laugh lines, earned through genuine joy, silver threading through auburn hair she refused to dye, and hands that bore the calluses of a woman who'd learned to fix what she could and accept what she couldn't. At 42, she'd buried a husband, raised a son largely alone, and inherited a house that demanded more than she could give. Grandmother always said the house had a stubborn spirit, Harper replied, settling beside him on the floor, with a grace that spoke of countless mornings spent in similar surrender to circumstance. Guess it's been keeping us alive out of spite. Eli accepted the coffee gratefully, noting how Harper's fingers lingered just a moment longer than necessary when their hands brushed. 3 months into their arrangement, couldn't quite call it a marriage yet, and they still moved around each other like cautious dancers learning new steps. "Tell me about her," he said, because in the quiet morning light, with sawdust motes dancing between them, it felt like the right time for such conversations. Harper's smile carried the weight of memory. Rose Quinn was a force of nature, came to Willowbrook in 1935 with nothing but a suitcase and a fierce determination to make something of herself. She bought this place when it was already old, turned it into a boarding house that became the heart of Main Street. Everyone who needed a fresh start seemed to find their way to her door. "Like us," Eli observed quietly. "Like us." Harper's voice held a note of wonder, as if she was still surprised by the turn her life had taken. She used to say that a house wasn't made of wood and nails, but of the stories that happened inside it. All the people who'd laughed and cried and dreamed within these walls. Eli understood that philosophy intimately. His own story had been shaped by houses, the cramped apartment where he'd raised Mia alone after Sarah's death, the hospital rooms where medical bills had piled up like autumn leaves, and now this grand old Victorian that promised either salvation or final defeat. "Where's Mia this morning?" Harper asked, as if reading his thoughts. "Upstairs with Jake, probably plotting some new adventure." Eli's voice carried the particular mixture of pride and concern that belonged to single fathers. "She's been different since we moved in, more confident. Yesterday I caught her laughing, really laughing for the first time since the funeral." Mia Turner, 8 years old and carrying grief like a stone in her small chest, had been Eli's entire world for 2 years. Her mother's death from cancer had left them both hollow, and the medical bills had ensured that grief was seasoned with financial terror. But here, in this house full of creaking floors and unexpected kindness, she was beginning to unfold again. "Jake's been good for her," Harper said. "And she's been good for him. He's never had a sibling before, and I think he was starting to feel the weight of being my only anchor to the world. Jake Quinn, 10 years old, and blessed with his mother's intuitive wisdom, had accepted Eli and Mia with the easy grace of a child who understood that families came in many forms. He'd appointed himself as Mia's protector and guide, showing her the house's secret passages and the best spots in the garden for finding four-leaf clovers. The sound of footsteps on the main staircase announced the arrival of Mrs. Holloway, the house's longest-term resident. Eleanor Holloway had moved into the front bedroom in 1987 and had become as much a part of the house's foundation as the original stone basement. She was 73, sharp as a tack, and possessed opinions about everything from proper tea brewing to the moral decline of television programming. "Morning, you two," she called, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd earned the right to speak her mind. "I've been thinking about those electrical problems you mentioned, Eli. My late husband was an electrician, and I remember him saying something about the way they wired these old houses. Might be worth checking the basement for any original documentation." Eli looked up from his toolbox with genuine interest. Documentation, building permits, electrical diagrams, that sort of thing. Rose was meticulous about keeping records. Used to say that a house's history was as important as its structure. "There's a storage room down there that nobody's touched in years." Harper's eyes lit up with the kind of enthusiasm that suggested adventure. "I'd forgotten about that room. Grandmother always kept it locked, said it was full of important papers that needed protecting." "Sounds like our morning just got more interesting," Eli said, closing his toolbox with a decisive snap. The basement of the Quinn Victorian felt like stepping into the earth's memory. The air was cool and thick with the scent of old wood and forgotten time. Eli's flashlight beam danced across stone walls and wooden support beams that had held the house steady for nearly a century. Harper followed close behind, her footsteps echoing in the enclosed space. "There," she said, pointing to a wooden door tucked beneath the main staircase. "That's the room Mrs. Holloway mentioned." The door was solid oak, darkened with age, and secured with a brass lock that looked original to the house. Harper produced a key ring from her pocket, fingers searching through the collection until she found an ornate brass key that seemed to match the lock's vintage. "I've been carrying these keys for 3 years," she admitted, "but I've never had the courage to explore what they unlock." The lock turned with surprising ease, as if it had been waiting patiently for this moment. The door swung open to reveal a small room lined with wooden shelves and filing cabinets. The air inside was dry and surprisingly well preserved, suggesting that Rose Quinn had taken measures to protect whatever lay within. Eli's flashlight illuminated boxes of documents, rolled blueprints, and what appeared to be decades of carefully organized records. But it was Harper who noticed the unusual detail. "Eli," she said softly, "look at this." She was standing before a section of wall that seemed different from the rest. The wood paneling here was slightly newer, and when she pressed against it, it gave slightly under her touch. "That's not original construction," Eli observed, running his hands along the edges. "Someone added this section later, recently, maybe within the last 20 years. Harper's eyes met his in the flashlight's glow. "Grandmother died 15 years ago. She must have done this work herself, or had it done." Eli found the hidden latch after several minutes of careful exploration. The panel swung inward to reveal a small safe built into the wall behind. The safe was modern, electronic, and completely at odds with the Victorian-era surroundings. "She was protecting something," Harper whispered. "Something important enough to hide behind a hidden panel in a locked room in her own basement." The safe required a combination, and Harper stared at the digital display with a mixture of hope and frustration. "I have no idea what numbers she would have used." "Try her birthday," Eli suggested. Harper shook her head. "I tried that on everything when I was settling her estate. She was too clever for obvious answers." They spent the next hour attempting various combinations, important dates, house numbers, even the year the house was built. Nothing worked. The safe remained stubbornly sealed, its contents a mystery that seemed to mock their efforts. "We'll figure it out." Eli said finally, his voice carrying the confidence of a man who'd learned to solve problems through persistence and patience. Your grandmother left clues. We just need to learn how to read them. Back upstairs, they found Mia and Jake in the kitchen, heads bent over a plate of Mrs. Holloway's famous snickerdoodles. The children looked up with the guilty expressions of conspirators caught in the act. We were just testing them, Jake explained solemnly, to make sure they weren't poisoned or anything. Very responsible, Harper said, fighting back a smile. And what's your professional opinion? Definitely safe, Mia declared, her voice stronger than Eli had heard it in months. But we should probably eat a few more, just to be absolutely certain. The afternoon brought Tommy Chen, the local postal worker who'd been delivering mail to the Quinn Victorian for 12 years. Tommy was one of those people who seemed to know everyone's business without being nosy about it, and his daily visits had become as much about checking on the house's residents as delivering their correspondence. "Heard you two are making progress with the electrical work," he said, handing Harper a stack of letters. "Mrs. Patterson from the diner was saying the lights haven't flickered once this week." "Eli's been working miracles," Harper replied, sorting through the mail. "I think the house likes having a man around to fix things properly." Tommy's expression grew serious. "Speaking of fixing things, you might want to know there's been some talk around town. Nothing specific, but some folks in suits have been asking questions about the Victorian, claiming to be from some real estate company." Eli looked up from his work, instincts sharpened by years of protective fatherhood. "What kind of questions?" "Property values, mostly, but also asking about the house's history, who owns it, whether there might be any legal complications with the deed. The kind of questions that make a man wonder what they're really after." Harper's face had gone pale. "Legal complications? Could be nothing," Tommy said quickly, "but in my experience, when strangers start asking detailed questions about a specific property, it usually means someone's planning something. Thought you should know." After Tommy left, Eli and Harper found themselves back in the basement, staring at the mysterious safe with new urgency. The discovery felt less like an adventure now, and more like a race against time. "What if grandmother was protecting something from exactly these kinds of people?" Harper asked. "What if she knew that someday someone would come asking questions about the house?" Eli studied the safe's digital display, thinking about the woman who'd built this hiding place. "Tell me more about her character. What mattered to her most?" Harper closed her eyes, reaching for memories. Family, this house, the people who lived here. She used to say that she'd been given a second chance at life when she came to Willowbrook, and she wanted to make sure others had the same opportunity. "Second chance," Eli repeated thoughtfully. "When did she arrive in town?" 1935. She was 25 years old. Eli's fingers moved over the keypad, entering 1935. The display flashed, "Read incorrect." He tried 1925, her birth year. Read again. "What about the house?" he asked. "When was it built?" 1892, but she bought it in 1936. Another red flash. Eli stepped back, thinking like a man who'd learned to solve problems by understanding the people who created them. She valued second chances. She came here to start over. What if the combination isn't about dates at all? Harper looked at him with growing understanding. What if it's about the people who mattered to her? They spent the next hour exploring every angle they could think of, but the safe remained locked, its secrets protected by an elderly woman's careful planning. As the sun began to set through the basement's small windows, they finally admitted defeat. "We'll try again tomorrow," Eli said, his arm finding its way around Harper's shoulders in a gesture that felt increasingly natural. Whatever she was protecting, it's waited this long. It can wait a little longer. But as they climbed the stairs back to the main floor, both of them carried the growing certainty that their time for leisurely investigation was running out. The men in suits, the questions about legal complications, the mysterious safe, all of it pointed toward a convergence that would soon demand answers they didn't yet have. That evening, as they sat on the front porch watching Mia and Jake chase fireflies in the gathering dusk. Harper leaned against Eli's shoulder with a sigh that contained both contentment and concern. "I keep thinking about what Mrs. Holloway said," she murmured, "about the house's history being as important as its structure. What if grandmother wasn't just keeping records? What if she was keeping secrets?" Eli's hand found hers, fingers intertwining with the easy comfort of two people who'd learned to find strength in each other. "Then we'll uncover them together. Whatever your grandmother was protecting, we'll make sure it stays protected." The fireflies danced in the darkness, and somewhere in the distance, the town's old clock tower chimed the hour, its deep bronze voice carrying across the quiet streets like a promise that time, patient and persistent, would eventually reveal all truths. The old wiring behind the parlor wall fought Eli like a living thing, copper and cloth insulation tangled in configurations that defied both logic and building codes. He'd been working in the cramped space for 3 hours, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool morning air, when his pry bar struck something that definitely wasn't electrical conduit. "That's odd," he muttered, adjusting his headlamp to better illuminate the cavity between the wall studs. The obstacle was metal, rectangular, and wedged tight between two support beams. Eli worked carefully, mindful of the delicate plaster that Harper was hoping to preserve wherever possible. The house's character lay in these original details, she'd explained, and every piece they could save was a connection to the stories that had played out within these rooms. "Harper," he called, excitement creeping into his voice. "You might want to see this." She appeared in the parlor doorway within moments, flour dusting her apron from the morning's bread-making session. "What did you find?" "I'm not sure yet, but it's definitely not original to the house." Eli gave the object another careful tug, and suddenly it came free, with a shower of old plaster and mouse droppings. "It's a strongbox, metal, about the size of a shoebox and heavy." Harper moved closer, her eyes wide with curiosity. The box was clearly old, its green paint faded and chipped, with a simple latch mechanism that had been secured with a small padlock. The metal showed spots of rust, but the overall structure seemed sound. "I've never seen this before," Harper said, reaching out to touch the worn surface. "But then again, I never had reason to tear into the walls." Eli set the box on the parlor's mahogany coffee table, and they both stared at it for a moment, as if expecting it to reveal its secrets through simple observation. The lock was old but sturdy, and there was no obvious key among Harper's inherited collection. "We could probably cut it off," Eli suggested, "but if there's something fragile inside—" "Wait." Harper disappeared for a moment, returning with the key ring she'd used in the basement. Grandmother was methodical about everything. If she hid this box, she probably left a way to open it. The third key she tried slid into the lock as if it had been waiting decades for this exact moment. The mechanism turned with a soft click that seemed to echo in the quiet room. Harper's hands trembled slightly as she lifted the lid, and Eli found himself holding his breath. Inside, wrapped in what had once been white tissue paper, lay a collection of documents, photographs, and ledger books that immediately spoke of importance and careful preservation. The topmost item was a leather-bound journal, its cover worn smooth by handling. Harper lifted it carefully, opening to the first page where neat handwriting in faded ink declared, "The true history of Rose Eleanor Quinn and the Willowbrook Trust, for my granddaughter, when the time comes." "She knew," Harper whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Somehow, she knew I'd find this." Eli moved closer, reading over her shoulder as Harper turned the pages. The journal detailed Rose Quinn's arrival in Willowbrook in 1935, but not as the simple woman seeking a fresh start that family legend had always portrayed. According to her own words, Rose had come to town with a specific mission and resources that far exceeded what a young woman of that era should have possessed. "Listen to this," Harper read aloud, her voice growing stronger. "The railroad men had taken too much from too many people. The bank was in their pocket, the mayor was on their payroll, and families were losing their homes faster than crops fail in drought. Someone had to stand between the powerful and the powerless, and circumstances had made me that someone. The journal went on to describe how Rose had used money from an unnamed source to purchase property throughout Willowbrook, always at fair prices and often saving families from foreclosure. But more intriguingly, she'd established what she called the Willowbrook Trust, a financial mechanism designed to protect the town's residents from future economic predators. "Look at these ledgers," Eli said, pulling out one of the bound record books. The pages were filled with meticulous entries documenting property purchases, trust fund deposits, and what appeared to be a complex system of legal protections. She wasn't just buying property, she was building a fortress. Harper found a manila envelope marked for legal verification and opened it with hands that were no longer trembling. Inside were official documents, bank records, and correspondence that painted a picture of financial activity spanning decades. But it was the bottom document that made her sink into the parlor's overstuffed armchair. "Eli," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "this is a bank statement from an account I've never heard of." She held up the paper, pointing to the final balance line. "Look at the amount." Eli leaned over her shoulder, following her finger to the neat typescript that recorded the account's value. The number seemed impossible, so large that his mind initially refused to process it. $300 million. $300 million, sitting in an account that bore Harper's grandmother's name, and according to the documentation, now belonged to Harper herself. "That can't be right," Harper said, echoing his own disbelief. Grandmother lived modestly. She always worried about money, always counted every penny. There's no way she had access to this kind of wealth. But the evidence was undeniable. Page after page of documentation detailed the trust's growth over decades, carefully managed investments, and legal structures that had protected the money from discovery or seizure. And according to the final document in the envelope here, dated just 6 months before Rose Quinn's death, the entire trust was to be transferred to her granddaughter upon the discovery of these papers. She was waiting for you to find this, Eli realized. All those years of careful living, all the worry about the house's expenses, she was protecting something much larger. Harper stood and walked to the parlor window, looking out at the town beyond. Main Street stretched away from the Victorian, lined with small businesses and modest homes that had weathered decades of economic uncertainty. From this vantage point, she could see the struggling diner, the used bookstore with its going out of business sign, and the empty storefront that had once housed the town's only pharmacy. $300 million, she repeated, as if saying the number aloud might make it more believable. Enough to save every business on Main Street. Enough to ensure that no family in Willowbrook ever loses their home to foreclosure again. Eli joined her at the window, his practical mind already working through the implications. But why hide it? Why live in poverty when she had access to this kind of wealth? Harper turned back to the journal, searching for answers. She found them in an entry dated 1987, the year Mrs. Holloway had moved into the boarding house. The railroad money came with chains, even after all these years. There are people who would kill to control this trust, people who've spent lifetimes building power on the assumption that Willowbrook would stay poor and desperate. The money can only be revealed when someone is strong enough to fight for it and smart enough to use it wisely. Railroad money, Eli repeated. What do you think that means? Before Harper could answer, the sound of a car door slamming in the driveway drew their attention back to the window. A black sedan had pulled up to the curb, and 2 men in expensive suits were walking toward the front porch with the purposeful stride of people who expected to be taken seriously. "I don't think we're going to have much time to figure this out gradually," Harper said, quickly gathering the documents back into the strongbox. "Something tells me those aren't social visitors." The doorbell's chime echoed through the house, followed by a knock that was polite but insistent. Harper and Eli exchanged glances, both understanding that the discovery of the strongbox had somehow triggered events beyond their control. "Mrs. Quinn?" The voice from the porch was smooth, professional, and carried the kind of authority that came from legal training. "We're representatives from Meridian Development Group. We'd like to discuss a business proposition regarding your property." Harper's hands moved quickly, securing the strongbox and sliding it into the antique secretary desk that stood against the parlor's far wall. "Coming," she called, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. As she walked toward the front door, Eli close behind her, Harper couldn't shake the feeling that they'd just crossed a threshold from which there would be no return. The money in that account represented power, the power to transform Willowbrook, to protect families, to ensure that predatory developers could never again threaten the community her grandmother had worked so hard to shield. But power, as Rose Quinn had clearly understood, always came with a price. And judging by the expensive suits and determined expressions of the men waiting on her porch, that price was about to be demanded in full. The lock clicked as Harper turned the deadbolt, and she opened the door to face whatever consequences her grandmother's carefully guarded secrets were about to unleash upon their quiet little world. The men from Meridian Development Group had smiles that never reached their eyes and business cards printed on expensive stock. Marcus Webb, the taller of the two, introduced himself as a senior acquisitions specialist, while his companion, David Chen, claimed expertise in historical property valuations. They spoke in practiced phrases about market opportunities and development potential, but their questions focused on details that had nothing to do with real estate values. "The Victorian-era architecture is certainly charming," Webb said, his gaze sweeping the parlor with calculating precision. "But we understand there may be some documentation issues with the property. Original deeds, family records, that sort of thing. Our research suggests the Quinn family history might be more complex than local records indicate." Harper maintained her composure, drawing on reserves of strength she hadn't known she possessed. "The house has been in my family for nearly 90 years. I'm not aware of any documentation issues." "Of course not," Chen interjected smoothly. "These things often surface unexpectedly. Old paperwork, forgotten legal obligations, tax irregularities that previous generations might have overlooked. We're prepared to help resolve any such complications, naturally." Eli stepped closer to Harper, his presence both protective and steadying. "Seems like you gentlemen are fishing for information rather than making an actual offer." Webb's smile remained fixed, but something cold flickered behind his eyes. "Mr. Turner, isn't it? We understand you're new to the household. Sometimes fresh perspectives can be valuable when assessing a property's true potential." The implied threat was subtle but unmistakable. They knew about Eli, about the marriage, probably about his financial situation and Mia's medical bills. This wasn't a casual business call, it was intelligence gathering wrapped in corporate politeness. After the men left with promises to be in touch soon, Harper and Eli returned to the strongbox with new urgency. The journal contained more than just financial records. It held the key to understanding why Rose Quinn had felt the need to hide her activities so carefully. "Look at this," Harper said, pointing to an entry from 1952. "They came again today, asking about the railroad money. I told them what I've always told them. Rose Quinn knows nothing about missing railroad funds, but they're getting desperate, and desperate men make dangerous choices. The trust must remain hidden until someone strong enough can claim it properly." Eli found a bundle of letters tied with blue ribbon, the paper yellowed with age, but the ink still legible. The handwriting was different from Rose's journal, entries masculine, confident, and signed with only the initial J. "My dearest Rose," he read aloud from the topmost letter, "the money is safe, but not for long. Morrison's people are getting closer, and the Railroad Commission is asking questions I can't keep deflecting. We must move the funds soon, before they can trace the connection back to you." Harper looked up from the journal. Morrison, that name appears in grandmother's entries too. She wrote about him like he was some kind of enemy. They spent the next hour piecing together a story that was far more complex than either had imagined. The letters revealed that Rose Quinn had been in love with a man named Jonathan, someone with access to railroad funds, who had apparently redirected money to protect Willowbrook from corporate exploitation. But the romance had ended tragically, and Rose had been left to guard both the money and the secret of its origins. "Listen to this letter," Harper said, her voice heavy with emotion. "I know you think I'm abandoning you, but staying would put us both in danger. Morrison will never stop looking for the money, and if he connects you to me, everything we've worked for will be lost. Hide the trust well, my love. Someday, when the corruption is finally exposed, someone will be brave enough to claim what's rightfully theirs." The final letter in the bundle was different, shorter, more urgent, and dated just weeks before Jonathan's apparent departure from Willowbrook. "Rose, if something happens to me, remember what I told you about the clock tower. The final key is where we shared our first kiss, where you promised to wait for me forever. Trust no one from the railroad, and remember that Morrison's reach extends further than you know. All my love, Jay." Eli set the letter down carefully. "The clock tower, that's the second reference to it we've found. Grandmother used to take me there when I was little," Harper said, her eyes distant with memory. "She'd tell me stories about the town's history, about the people who'd built Willowbrook with their own hands. But she never mentioned any romantic connection to the place." The sound of children's laughter from the garden drew their attention to the window. Mia and Jake were playing an elaborate game that involved hiding behind the old oak tree and staging dramatic rescues. Watching them, Harper felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders like a familiar shawl. "Whatever my grandmother was protecting," she said quietly, "it's ours to protect now. That money could transform this town, but only if we can figure out how to claim it safely." Eli's hand found hers, his calloused fingers providing steady comfort. "We'll figure it out together, but first, we need to understand what we're up against. These Meridian development people aren't going away, and they clearly know more about your family's history than they're letting on." That afternoon brought Dr. Patricia Vance, Willowbrook's only physician, and one of the few people who'd known Rose Quinn personally during her final years. Patricia had retired from active practice but still maintained an office above the old pharmacy, and her medical expertise had been invaluable during Mia's recovery from her mother's death. "I heard about your visitors this morning," Patricia said, settling into the parlor's most comfortable chair with the ease of someone who'd been welcomed in this house for decades. Tommy Chen mentioned men in suits asking questions around town. Harper poured tea from her grandmother's china service, a ritual that had always brought comfort during difficult conversations. They claimed to be from a development company, but their questions seemed more focused on family history than property values. Patricia's expression grew thoughtful. "Your grandmother came to see me about 6 months before she died. She was worried about something, kept asking about legal procedures for transferring property and assets. At the time, I assumed she was just making sure everything was properly arranged for you." "Did she mention anything specific?" Eli asked. "Any concerns about outside threats or family secrets?" "She asked me about a safety deposit box at the bank in Carson Creek. Wanted to know how to ensure that only specific people could access it after her death. I remember thinking it was odd, because Rose had always done her banking right here in Willowbrook." Harper's pulse quickened. Carson Creek was the county seat, 30 miles away, and large enough to offer the kind of anonymity that Willowbrook couldn't provide. "Did she give you any details about what was in the box?" "No, but she did ask me to witness her signature on some documents. Legal papers that she said were insurance for the future. She made me promise never to mention the visit unless you specifically asked about it." After Patricia left, Harper and Eli found themselves back in the basement storage room, searching through Rose's meticulously organized files for any reference to Carson Creek or safety deposit boxes. They found it in a folder marked Emergency Procedures, a key taped to an index card with instructions written in Rose's careful handwriting. "First National Bank of Carson Creek, Box 247. Access granted only upon presentation of this key and proof of discovery of the Willowbrook Trust documentation. Tell them Rose sent you." Eli held the small silver key up to the light, noting the bank's logo engraved on its surface. She planned for everything, didn't she? She had to, Harper realized. If Jonathan was right about Morrison's reach extending beyond the railroad, Grandmother would have needed multiple layers of protection. The safety deposit box is probably just one piece of a much larger puzzle. That evening, as they sat on the front porch watching the sun set behind the hills that cradled Willowbrook, Harper felt the strange sensation of standing at a crossroads between past and future. The money in the trust represented possibilities she'd never dared imagine, not just for her own family, but for every person in town who'd struggled with poverty, foreclosure, or the kind of quiet desperation that came from watching opportunity pass them by. "I keep thinking about that letter," she said, watching Mia and Jake chase fireflies in the gathering dusk. About Jonathan telling Grandmother to wait for someone brave enough to claim what's rightfully theirs. What if he wasn't talking about courage in the traditional sense? Eli considered this, his engineer's mind working through the implications. What if he meant someone who understood the responsibility that comes with that kind of power? Exactly. Grandmother didn't hide the money because she was afraid of it. She hid it because she understood that revealing it too soon to the wrong person could destroy everything she was trying to protect. The clock tower's bronze voice carried across the quiet streets, marking the hour with deep, resonant chimes that had counted time in Willowbrook for over a century. Somewhere in that tower, according to Jonathan's letter, lay the final piece of the puzzle that would unlock Rose Quinn's carefully guarded legacy. But as Harper listened to the familiar sound, she couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. The men from Meridian Development had retreated for now, but they'd be back with more questions, more pressure, and probably more knowledge about the trust than she felt comfortable with them possessing. Whatever secrets the clock tower held, she and Eli would need to find them soon before someone else found them first. The Carson Creek expedition required careful planning and even more careful explanation to Mrs. Rees Holloway, who had appointed herself as the children's unofficial guardian whenever Harper and Eli needed to venture beyond Willowbrook's familiar boundaries. The elderly woman listened to their story about needing to handle some banking matters with the skeptical attention of someone who'd raised 3 children and buried 2 husbands. "Banking matters that require both of you and can't be conducted over the telephone," she repeated, her tone suggesting she wasn't entirely convinced but was willing to be accommodating. "Well, I suppose young Jake and Mia can help me with my spring cleaning project. Lord knows this old house could use some attention." The drive to Carson Creek took them through rolling farmland that showcased the prosperity that had largely bypassed Willowbrook. Modern barns stood beside efficient irrigation systems, and the livestock looked well-fed and carefully tended. It was a reminder of what economic stability could accomplish, and Harper found herself imagining similar improvements throughout her own community. First, National Bank of Carson Creek occupied a solid brick building that spoke of institutional permanence and conservative financial management. The lobby was quiet, efficiently air-conditioned, and staffed by people who clearly took their responsibilities seriously. When Harper approached the customer service desk and explained that she needed to access a safety deposit box belonging to Rose Quinn, the representative's expression grew both professional and cautious. "Mrs. Quinn's account has been flagged for special handling," the woman explained, her nameplate identifying her as Beverly Morrison. "I'll need to verify your identity and your authorization to access the box." The surname sent a chill down Harper's spine, but she maintained her composure while providing the required documentation. Beverly Morrison examined the key, checked Harper's identification against bank records, and made a phone call to someone in the back office before finally nodding with satisfaction. "Everything appears to be in order. Mrs. Quinn left very specific instructions about this box. She indicated that access should only be granted upon presentation of the key and confirmation that you'd discovered certain family documents. May I ask what documents you found?" Harper chose her words carefully. "My grandmother's journal and some financial records that I wasn't previously aware of." Beverly's expression suggested this was the correct answer. She led Harper and Eli through a series of security procedures and into the vault where Rose Quinn's safety deposit box waited like a time capsule from a more cautious era. The box contained exactly what Harper had hoped to find: more pieces of the puzzle that Rose had carefully scattered across multiple locations. There was a detailed map of Willowbrook dating from 1936, with specific properties marked in red ink and notations in Rose's handwriting. There were also legal documents that expanded on the trust information they'd found in the strongbox, and a sealed letter addressed simply to "my granddaughter." But it was the map that immediately captured their attention. The red markings showed not just the properties Rose had purchased over the years, but also parcels of land that extended far beyond what Harper had known about. According to the map's annotations, Rose Quinn had quietly acquired nearly a third of Willowbrook's residential and commercial properties, creating a network of holdings that effectively protected the town's core from outside development. "Look at this," Eli said, pointing to a series of numbers written alongside each marked property. "These look like financial notations, purchase prices maybe, or current valuations." Harper studied the figures, her understanding of her grandmother's activities growing more complex with each revelation. She wasn't just buying properties to help individual families. She was creating a buffer zone. Anyone who wanted to develop Willowbrook commercially would have to go through her first. The sealed letter provided context that made Rose's strategy even more impressive. "My dear granddaughter, if you're reading this, it means you've begun to understand the true scope of what I've tried to accomplish in Willowbrook. The trust fund that Jonathan helped me establish was never meant to be hoarded or spent carelessly. It was meant to be a tool for protecting good people from those who would exploit their vulnerabilities. The map shows you the extent of the properties I've acquired over the years. Each purchase was made to prevent foreclosure, to keep families in their homes, or to ensure that essential businesses could remain in local hands. The rent from these properties has been minimal, just enough to cover expenses and taxes, because the goal was never profit. The goal was protection. But you should know that this protection comes with enemies. The railroad money that Jonathan redirected was supposed to fund a development project that would have transformed Willowbrook into a company town. When that money disappeared, powerful people lost fortunes they had counted on. They've never stopped looking for it, and they've never stopped trying to gain control of our community through other means. The man Morrison, whom you'll hear mentioned in Jonathan's letters, has sons and grandsons who've inherited both his wealth and his determination to claim what he believes belongs to him. They've spent decades building political connections and business relationships that give them influence far beyond what their actual power should allow. If you choose to claim this inheritance, you'll be choosing to continue a fight that has lasted for generations. But you won't be fighting alone. The map will show you which families in Willowbrook are protected by the trust, and most of them don't even know it. When the time comes to reveal the truth, you'll find you have more allies than you might expect. Harper folded the letter carefully, her hands steadier than she felt. Morrison. The bank representative's name was Beverly Morrison. That can't be a coincidence. Eli's expression had grown grim, which means they know we're here. They probably know exactly what we found in that box. As if summoned by their concern, Beverly Morrison appeared in the vault doorway with an apologetic smile that didn't quite mask the calculation in her eyes. "I'm sorry to interrupt, but I wanted to make sure you found everything you were looking for." Mrs. Quinn was very specific about the contents of that box. "Everything seems to be in order," Harper replied, gathering the documents with what she hoped appeared to be casual efficiency. "Thank you for your assistance." "Of course. I should mention that there have been other inquiries about Mrs. Quinn's accounts over the years. Various legal representatives asking about estate settlements and property transfers. Nothing improper, of course, but I thought you should be aware that your grandmother's affairs have generated some interest." The drive back to Willowbrook was tense, both Harper and Eli aware that their investigation had crossed some kind of threshold. The map and documents now in their possession represented not just financial assets, but evidence of a conflict that had been brewing for decades. "We need to talk to people in town," Harper said as they passed the familiar landmarks that marked Willowbrook's boundaries. If grandmother was protecting families without them knowing it, some of them might have information that could help us understand what we're really dealing with. Their first stop was Patterson's Diner, where Margaret Patterson had been serving coffee and comfort food for 25 years. Margaret was one of those people who seemed to know everyone's business without being judgmental about it, and her diner served as an unofficial information exchange for anyone who needed to know what was really happening in Willowbrook. Rose Quinn was a saint, Margaret said when Harper asked about her grandmother's relationship with local businesses. "When my first husband died and left me with nothing but debt and this building, she's the one who helped me restructure the mortgage. Claimed the bank owed her a favor, but I always suspected she paid the difference herself." "Did she ever mention any concerns about outside developers or business interests?" Eli asked. Margaret's expression grew thoughtful. "Now that you mention it, she did warn me once about signing any papers from companies I didn't recognize. Said there were people who made their living by taking advantage of small business owners who didn't understand the fine print. This was maybe 5 years ago, right around the time that pharmaceutical company was trying to buy up properties for some kind of distribution center." Harper felt pieces clicking into place. "What happened with the pharmaceutical company?" "Strangest thing. They had options on half the commercial properties on Main Street, but when it came time to close the deals, the landowners all backed out. Said they'd received better offers from a private investor who wanted to preserve the town's character. The private investor, Harper realized, had almost certainly been her grandmother, working through intermediaries to protect Willowbrook from corporate exploitation. But the pattern suggested that the threats had been ongoing, that Rose's vigilance had been tested repeatedly over the years. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Sheriff Tom Bradley, whose presence in the diner usually meant either an appetite for Margaret's apple pie or official business that required discretion. Given his expression, Harper suspected it wasn't about pie. "Harper, Eli," he said, settling onto the stool beside them with the careful movements of a man whose knees had logged too many years of public service. "I hate to bother you folks, but I've been getting some unusual calls about activities at the Victorian. Nothing specific, just people claiming to be concerned about security issues related to the property." "What kind of security issues?" Harper asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "Claims about unauthorized access to historical documents, suggestions that there might be valuable items stored on the property without proper security measures. The kind of vague complaints that come from people who want law enforcement to take an interest in someone's private business." Eli's jaw tightened. "Let me guess. These calls came from representatives of Meridian Development Group, among others. I've also had inquiries from a law firm in the state capital, and someone claiming to represent the Historical Preservation Society. All very official, all very concerned about the proper handling of potentially significant historical materials." Margaret refilled their coffee cups with the practiced efficiency of someone who understood that serious conversations required proper lubrication. "Tom, you've known the Quinn family for years. Does any of this feel right to you?" Sheriff Bradley's smile was grim. "Margaret, in my experience, when multiple outside parties suddenly develop intense interest in someone's private property, it usually means that property is worth a lot more than anyone realized. The question is whether the current owners are going to be allowed to benefit from that value, or whether legal complications are going to transfer ownership to people with better lawyers." The implication was clear, and Harper felt the weight of her grandmother's warnings settling over her like gathering storm clouds. The fight that Rose Quinn had begun was far from over, and the stakes were apparently high enough to attract attention from interests with significant resources and flexible ethics. As they prepared to leave the diner, Margaret leaned across the counter with the conspiratorial air of someone sharing valuable intelligence. "Harper, if you're dealing with the kind of people I think you're dealing with, you might want to talk to Eleanor Holloway about her late husband's work. Henry Holloway knew more about this town's real history than most people realized, and Eleanor's got a memory like a steel trap." The suggestion proved to be exactly the guidance they needed. When they returned to the Victorian and shared their discoveries with Mrs. Holloway, the elderly woman's reaction confirmed that their investigation was heading in the right direction. Henry always said that Rose Quinn was fighting a war that most people didn't even know was happening, she said, settling into her favorite chair with the satisfaction of someone who'd been waiting years for the right person to ask the right questions. He helped her with some of the legal paperwork over the years, and he always warned me that someday someone would come looking for what she'd hidden. The clock tower chimed the evening hour, its bronze voice carrying across Willowbrook like a promise that time would eventually reveal all truths. But as Harper listened to the familiar sound, she understood that some truths came with a price that would test everything she believed about family, community, and the courage required to protect both. Mrs. Holloway's revelation about her late husband's involvement with Rose Quinn opened doors that Harper hadn't even known existed. Eleanor led them to Henry's old study, a small room on the second floor that had been left untouched since his death 5 years earlier. The space was a bibliophile's dream floor-to-ceiling bookshelves filled with legal texts, historical volumes, and personal journals that documented a lifetime of careful observation. Henry was convinced that Rose was protecting something bigger than just this house, Eleanor explained, running her fingers along the spines of law books with the reverence of someone who understood their true value. He helped her establish some kind of legal trust structure back in the 1960s, but she never told him the full scope of what she was planning. Eli examined the desk where Henry Holloway had spent countless hours working on legal documents and town business. The surface was covered with the organized clutter of a methodical mind fountain pens arranged by color, stacks of legal pads filled with precise handwriting, and a brass paperweight that caught the afternoon light streaming through the window. He kept everything, Eleanor continued, opening the desk center drawer to reveal files organized with obsessive precision. Every document he ever drafted, every conversation he thought might be important someday. If Rose shared any details about her plans, Henry would have recorded them. Harper found the relevant files in a folder marked Quinn Property, Trust Confidential. The documents inside painted a picture of legal maneuvering that was both brilliant and complex, designed to protect assets while maintaining absolute secrecy about their scope and purpose. "Look at this," she said, holding up a legal memorandum dated 1967. Henry was helping grandmother establish what he called layered protection protocols. Multiple shell companies, trust structures that referenced each other in circular patterns, and property transfers that were technically legal but virtually impossible to trace. Eli studied a hand-drawn diagram that showed the relationship between various legal entities. It's like a maze designed to confuse anyone trying to follow the money trail. But why make it so complicated? Eleanor settled into Henry's desk chair with a sigh that carried decades of accumulated wisdom. Because Rose knew that eventually someone with significant resources would come looking for what she'd hidden. She needed protection that would hold up in court while buying time for the right person to understand the full picture. The breakthrough came when Harper found an envelope tucked behind one of Henry's law books, sealed and marked, "For Rose's granddaughter emergency instructions." Inside was a brass key, unlike any of the others they'd discovered, along with a letter written in Henry's careful legal handwriting. "My dear Harper," the letter began, "if you're reading this, it means that Rose's fears about outside interference have proven justified. The key you're holding unlocks a safety deposit box at Willowbrook Savings, Lonethy, old building that's been empty since the bank moved to their new location in 1995. Rose asked me to maintain access to that building for exactly this purpose. What you'll find there represents the final piece of evidence you'll need to claim the Willowbrook Trust legally and safely. But more importantly, it contains the cipher key that will allow you to decode the location references in Jonathan's letters. Rose and Jonathan developed their own code system to protect sensitive information, and without the cipher key, those letters are just romantic correspondence." Harper turned the brass key over in her hands, noting the intricate engravings that covered its surface. Unlike the simple functional keys they'd used before, this one was clearly decorative, designed to be both beautiful and meaningful. "The old bank building," Eli said thoughtfully. "I've driven past it 100 times but never really paid attention. It's been boarded up for so long, I assumed it was just another empty building waiting for demolition." Eleanor's smile held secrets. Henry maintained the building's ownership through one of Rose's trust entities. Officially, it's been abandoned for decades. Unofficially, it's been waiting for exactly this moment. That evening, they made their way through Willowbrook's quiet streets toward the old Savings Loan building. The structure stood on a corner, lot 2 blocks from Main Street, its brick facade weathered but solid, windows covered with plywood that had aged to a silvery gray. In the gathering dusk, it looked like a monument to economic changes that had left small-town institutions behind. Eli used a crowbar to carefully remove the plywood covering the back entrance, working by flashlight to avoid drawing attention from the few residents who might still be awake. The brass key turned smoothly in the lock, as if the mechanism had been maintained despite the building's abandoned appearance. Inside, the old bank retained much of its original character. The main floor still held the teller windows and customer service area, though dust and time had dulled the brass fixtures and wooden counters. But it was the basement vault that held their destination, a smaller version of the safety deposit box room they'd visited in Carson Creek. Harper's key opened box 12, revealing documents that immediately clarified both the scope of Rose's planning and the urgency of their current situation. The cipher key was actually a complex substitution system that used the brass key's engravings as a reference guide. But more importantly, the box contained correspondence between Henry Holloway and various legal representatives that documented ongoing attempts to challenge the trust's legitimacy. "Look at these dates," Harper said, spreading the letters across a dusty table. "Someone's been trying to gain access to grandmother's assets for the past 10 years. Multiple law firms, different approaches, but all of them asking the same basic questions about property ownership and estate settlements." Eli used the cipher key to decode one of Jonathan's letters, the process slow but revealing. "The final treasure lies where time itself keeps watch, where lovers pledged eternal devotion beneath the guardian's bronze gaze. The heart of the mystery beats in the place where past and future meet." "The clock tower," Harper breathed. "He's talking about the clock tower." The decoded letter continued. "The combination that unlocks our legacy is written in the stars we counted together, the date when you said yes to forever, arranged in the sequence that only you and I would understand." Harper closed her eyes, reaching for family stories and half-remembered conversations. "Grandmother used to tell me about a romantic proposal that happened at the clock tower, but she always claimed it was just a local legend. She said the young man had to leave town before they could marry, but that the woman waited for him her whole life." "What if it wasn't a legend?" Eli asked. "What if she was telling you her own story?" They worked through the night, using the cipher key to decode all of Jonathan's letters and cross-referencing the clues with the property map from Carson Creek. The picture that emerged was both romantic and strategic. Jonathan and Rose had used their courtship as cover for activities that were redirecting substantial railroad funds to protect Willowbrook from corporate exploitation. But the letters also revealed a timeline that was growing urgent. Jonathan's final messages indicated that Morrison's investigators were closing in, and that the evidence needed to be secured quickly before it could be discovered and destroyed. "Rose," read one decoded passage, "our time is running out faster than I hoped. Morrison's people have traced some of the financial transfers, and they're putting pressure on my contacts at the Railroad Commission. I've arranged for one final transfer that will complete the Willowbrook Trust. But after that, I'll have to disappear completely. The clock tower holds the key to accessing everything we've built together, but only when someone worthy of the responsibility is ready to claim it." The final letter was dated just 3 days before Jonathan's apparent departure from Willowbrook, and its decoded message carried both hope and warning. "My beloved Rose, if you're reading this, it means I'm gone, and you're left to guard our secret alone. But you're not truly alone someday. Someone will love this town the way we do. Someone strong enough to fight for it, and wise enough to use our gift properly. When that person appears, the clock tower will reveal its final secret. Until then, trust no one from the railroad families, and remember that Morrison's reach extends into every level of government and business. Our love created something beautiful, but it also created enemies who will never forget or forgive. As dawn approached, Harper and Eli sat, surrounded by decoded letters, property maps, and legal documents that told a complete story of love, sacrifice, and careful planning that had protected Willowbrook for nearly 90 years. But the story was clearly approaching its climax, and the forces that Rose Quinn had held at bay for so long were finally mobilizing for a final confrontation. "We need to get to the clock tower," Harper said, watching the sun rise over Willowbrook's quiet streets. "Whatever grandmother and Jonathan hid there, it's the key to everything. But we also need to be prepared for the possibility that we're not the only ones who've figured that out." Eli gathered the documents carefully, his mind already working through the practical challenges of accessing a building that had been sealed for decades. "Then we'd better move fast. Something tells me our time for leisurely investigation just ran out." The brass cipher key caught the morning light as Harper slipped it into her pocket, its engravings now revealed as a map to secrets that had been waiting almost a century for the right people to claim them. But as they prepared to leave the old bank building, both of them understood that claiming those secrets would require courage, wisdom, and a willingness to fight for something bigger than their own immediate needs. The clock tower's bronze voice carried across Willowbrook, marking another hour in a conflict that had been decades in the making. Soon, that same voice would either celebrate their victory or toll the end of Rose Quinn's carefully protected legacy. The Willowbrook Town Hall occupied a modest brick building that had served as the community's administrative center since 1923. Mayor Janet Reeves, a practical woman in her 60s who'd held office for 12 years, greeted Harper and Eli with the cautious courtesy reserved for residents who might be bringing either good news or complicated problems. "I understand you're researching the clock tower," she said, leading them through hallways lined with framed photographs documenting Willowbrook's history. "That's an interesting coincidence, because I've had several inquiries about that building recently. Seems to have generated quite a bit of attention all of a sudden." Harper's pulse quickened. "What kind of inquiries?" "Historical preservation societies, architectural firms, even someone claiming to represent a documentary film company. All very official, all asking detailed questions about the tower's construction, maintenance records, and access procedures." They settled in the mayor's office, surrounded by filing cabinets that contained nearly a century of municipal records. Janet retrieved a thick folder marked "Clock Tower Construction Maintenance" and spread its contents across her desk. "The tower was built in 1898, she explained, pointing to the original architectural drawings. "Donated by the Willowbrook Railroad Company as part of their civic improvement initiative. The interesting thing is that the railroad spared no expense. The tower was built to last centuries, with specifications that went far beyond what a simple timepiece required." Eli studied the blueprints with the trained eye of someone who understood building construction. "These plans show a much more complex internal structure than you'd expect. Multiple levels, reinforced chambers, and what looks like a sophisticated ventilation system. The railroad engineers claimed they wanted to ensure the clock mechanism would remain accurate, regardless of weather conditions," Janet said, "but Henry Holloway always suspected there was more to it than that. He used to say the tower was built like a fortress disguised as a civic monument." Harper found herself studying a detail that had been added to the original blueprints in different ink. This notation Heretz, dated 1936, the year after grandmother arrived in Willowbrook. Someone modified the tower's internal structure. Janet leaned over to examine the marking. "That's Rose Quinn's handwriting. She served on the town council for 40 years, and she was particularly interested in maintaining the clock tower. Always said it was essential to preserve Willowbrook's most important landmark. The modified blueprints showed the addition of a sealed chamber within the tower's upper levels, accessible through a hidden entrance that required specific knowledge to locate. The chamber was designed to be both secure and environmentally controlled, perfect for long-term storage of sensitive materials. "Mayor Reeves," Eli said carefully, "has anyone else examined these blueprints recently?" Janet's expression grew troubled. "That's what concerns me. Yesterday, someone from the State Historical Commission requested copies of all our clock tower documentation, claimed they were conducting a comprehensive survey of significant architectural landmarks. But when I called the commission to verify the request, they said they'd never heard of the project." The implications were clear and unsettling. Someone was conducting their own investigation of the clock tower, using official-sounding credentials to gather the same information that Harper and Eli were seeking. The race to uncover Rose Quinn's final secret was no longer theoretical. "There's something else you should know," Janet continued, her voice dropping to the confidential tone reserved for sensitive municipal business. "I've been getting pressure from the county to declare the clock tower structurally unsound. Nothing official yet, but several county commissioners have suggested that the building might need to be demolished for public safety reasons." Harper felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. Demolished? The tower's been standing for over a century. What safety concerns could there possibly be? "That's exactly what I asked." The response was vague, something about foundation issues and potential structural instability. "But Harper, I've walked through that tower myself, and it's as solid as the day it was built. Someone wants access to that building, and if they can't get it legitimately, they're prepared to tear it down to claim whatever's inside." The mayor provided them with copies of the modified blueprints, along with a set of keys that would give them access to the tower's lower levels. "The upper chamber that Rose added requires a different key," she explained. "According to the records, only Rose ever had access to that space. But if you're going to explore the tower, you'd better do it soon. I can't hold off the county's demolition pressure indefinitely." Their next stop was the hardware store, where Ed Mackenzie had been selling tools and supplies to Willowbrook residents for 35 years. Ed possessed the kind of practical knowledge that came from helping people solve problems with their hands, and his memory for detail was legendary. "Clock tower's got some unusual features," he confirmed when Harper asked about the building's maintenance history. "Rose Quinn used to come in here every few months, buying specific supplies for what she called preservation work, heavy-duty locks, weather-sealing materials, precision tools that seemed too sophisticated for basic maintenance." "Did she ever mention what kind of preservation work she was doing?" Eli asked. Ed's smile carried decades of accumulated respect for Rose Quinn's privacy. Rose wasn't one to explain herself unnecessarily, but I got the impression she was protecting something up there, something that required careful environmental control and serious security measures. The hardware store's records showed a pattern of purchases that supported Ed's observations. Over the years, Rose had bought materials consistent with creating and maintaining a secure storage environment: dehumidifiers, insulation, reinforced containers, and locks that would have been appropriate for bank vaults. "Most interesting purchase was about 15 years ago," Ed said, consulting his meticulously kept sales records. "She bought a small safe, specifically designed for document storage. Had me special order it from a company that supplied banks and law firms. Cost more than most people spend on a car, but she paid cash without blinking." The safe, Harper realized, was probably what waited in the tower's hidden chamber. But accessing it would require more than just keys and blueprints. It would require understanding the personal codes that Rose and Jonathan had developed to protect their deepest secrets. That afternoon brought an unexpected visitor to the Victorian. Dr. Patricia Vance arrived with the determined air of someone who'd made a difficult decision and was prepared to see it through. "I've been thinking about our conversation," she said, settling into the parlor with the familiarity of an old friend. "About Rose's visit before she died, and the legal documents she asked me to witness. I didn't tell you everything, because I wasn't sure it was my place to interfere. Harper set aside the blueprints she'd been studying. What else did she tell you? Patricia reached into her medical bag and withdrew a sealed envelope. She gave me this, with instructions to deliver it, only if you started asking questions about the clock tower specifically. She said it contained information that would be essential when the time came to claim your inheritance. The envelope was addressed in Rose's handwriting. For Harper, when she understands that the tower holds the key to everything, inside was a single sheet of paper covered with numbers, letters, and symbols that appeared to be some kind of code. She also told me something else, Patricia continued. She said that when the time came for you to access the tower, you wouldn't be doing it alone. She said you'd have found someone who understood the value of fighting for what's right, someone who'd help you carry the responsibility that comes with great resources. Harper glanced at Eli, understanding that her grandmother had somehow anticipated not just the discovery of the trust, but also the partnership that would be essential to protecting it. The realization was both comforting and slightly unsettling. Rose Quinn's planning had extended even to the personal relationships that would shape the future. "There's something else," Patricia said, her voice carrying a note of urgency. "I've been hearing rumors around town about increased interest in the clock tower. People claiming to be structural engineers have been seen examining the building's foundation, and there's talk about emergency demolition procedures being expedited through county channels." Eli looked up from the coded message, his expression grim. "How long do we have?" "Days, maybe a week at most. Once the county issues a demolition order, accessing the tower will become legally impossible. Whatever Rose hid up there, you need to retrieve it before someone else decides to bring the whole building down." As Patricia prepared to leave, she paused at the parlor door with the expression of someone sharing a confidence that had been weighing on her conscience. "Harper, your grandmother wasn't just protecting money. She was protecting the idea that ordinary people deserve to control their own destiny, that communities shouldn't be bought and sold by whoever has the deepest pockets. What you do with her legacy will determine whether Willowbrook remains a place where families can build lives, or becomes just another development opportunity for people who see profit where others see home." That evening, as Harper and Eli worked to decode the message Patricia had delivered, the weight of responsibility settled over them like a familiar burden. The numbers and symbols gradually revealed themselves as coordinates and measurements that corresponded to specific locations within the clock tower, along with personal details that only someone who'd shared Rose's most intimate secrets could interpret. "The heart remembers what the mind forgets," the decoded message read. "When you stand where love began, count the stars we counted together, and remember that some treasures are too precious to entrust to banks or governments. The combination that unlocks our legacy beats in time with the heart that waits forever." Outside, the clock tower's bronze voice marked another hour in their countdown toward confrontation. Soon, they would climb those stairs, unlock that chamber, and discover whether Rose Quinn's lifetime of careful planning would be enough to protect Willowbrook from forces that had spent decades waiting for their opportunity to claim what they believed belonged to them. The blueprints lay spread across the parlor table like a map to treasure, and the brass cipher key waited in Harper's pocket like a promise that some secrets were worth the courage required to claim them. The clock tower stood against the morning sky like a sentinel that had watched over Willowbrook's secrets for more than a century. Harper and Eli approached the building with the careful attention of people who understood that their next few hours would determine not just their own future, but the future of an entire community. The tower's base was larger than it appeared from a distance, with thick stone walls that spoke of construction meant to endure. The main entrance, secured with a heavy oak door, opened easily with the keys Mayor Reeves had provided. Inside, a spiral staircase wound upward into shadows that seemed to hold decades of accumulated silence. "According to the blueprints," Eli said, consulting the modified architectural drawings, "the hidden chamber is on the 4th level, accessible through a panel that's designed to look like part of the original stonework. They climbed slowly, their footsteps echoing in the enclosed space. Each level of the tower revealed different aspects of its construction: the clock mechanism on the second level, a storage area on the third, and finally, the chamber that Rose Quinn had added to house her most precious secrets. The hidden panel was exactly where the blueprints indicated, disguised so cleverly that it would have been impossible to detect without specific knowledge of its location. Eli found the release mechanism after several minutes of careful exploration, and the panel swung inward to reveal a space that was both larger and more sophisticated than either of them had expected. The chamber contained not just the document safe that Ed Mackenzie had sold to Rose Quinn, but also display cases, filing cabinets, and what appeared to be a complete historical archive, documenting nearly a century of Willowbrook's hidden history. But it was the centerpiece of the collection that stopped them both in their tracks. Mounted in a place of honor on the chamber's far wall was a sheriff's badge, tarnished with age but still clearly readable. Sheriff R. Quinn, Willowbrook County, 1936, 1952. Beside it hung a photograph showing a young woman in official uniform, standing beside the courthouse steps with the confident bearing of someone who'd earned her authority through competence and courage. "She was the sheriff," Harper whispered, staring at photographic evidence that recontextualized everything she thought she knew about her grandmother's life. For 16 years, she was the county sheriff. Eli examined the display case that held the badge and photograph, noting the careful preservation and the obvious pride with which these items had been maintained. This explains how she had access to the railroad funds. She wasn't just a concerned citizen trying to protect the town. She was a law enforcement officer investigating criminal activity. A leather-bound journal mounted beside the badge contained Rose's own account of her law enforcement career, written in the careful prose of someone who understood that her story would someday need to serve as evidence. "I was appointed sheriff in 1936, the journal began. Not because the men of Willowbrook believed a woman could do the job, but because corruption had made it impossible for any local man to investigate the crimes being committed against our community. The Railroad Commission had bought every male candidate for the position, but they hadn't anticipated that a young woman might prove both incorruptible and effective. The journal detailed years of investigation into what Rose termed the systematic looting of Willowbrook. The railroad company, in partnership with local politicians and business leaders, had been using their economic influence to force property sales, manipulate land values, and redirect municipal funds into private accounts. The scope of the corruption was staggering, involving not just theft, but a coordinated effort to transform Willowbrook into a company town where ordinary residents would have no economic independence. Jonathan Morrison was not the enemy, Rose had written. He was the Railroad Commission's chief financial investigator, sent to Willowbrook to gather evidence of the corruption I'd been reporting. Our romance was real, but it was also the perfect cover for activities that would have been impossible if his true mission had been discovered. Harper sat down heavily in one of the chamber's chairs, overwhelmed by the complexity of a story that kept revealing new layers of deception and courage. Morrison wasn't trying to steal the money. He was trying to recover it for the people it had been stolen from. The journal continued. Jonathan's investigation revealed that over $3 million had been diverted from municipal accounts, land development funds, and federal railroad subsidies intended to benefit Willowbrook. But the corruption extended so far into state and federal government that conventional legal channels were useless. The only way to protect the money was to hide it until circumstances allowed for its proper use. Additional documents in the chamber showed how Rose and Jonathan had worked together to establish the Willowbrook Trust as both a legal entity and a hidden repository for recovered funds. The trust had grown over the decades through careful investment and the addition of properties purchased to protect families from foreclosure and businesses from hostile takeover. But the most shocking revelation came in a section of the journal dated 1952 the year Rose's official law enforcement career had ended. The Morrison family discovered Jonathan's true loyalty shortly before he was scheduled to testify before the Federal Railroad Commission. His death was officially ruled an accident, but I knew better. I also knew that his family would never stop looking for the money he'd helped me protect, and that they would use their considerable resources to eventually gain control of Willowbrook through legal and political channels. Harper looked up from the journal with eyes that reflected both grief and understanding. They killed him. Jonathan died protecting the money that was supposed to save this town. Eli found additional files that documented the Morrison family's activities over the subsequent decades' political contributions that ensured friendly treatment from regulatory agencies, business investments that gave them influence over regional development decisions, and legal maneuvers designed to challenge the property rights of anyone who stood in their way. "Look at this," he said, holding up a file marked "Current Threats Confidential." Rose kept track of every attempt to gain access to the trust, every legal challenge, every suspicious inquiry about property ownership in Willowbrook. She knew exactly who her enemies were and what they were planning. The file contained copies of correspondence between various Morrison family members and their legal representatives, dating from the 1960s through Rose's death in 2009. The letters revealed a persistent, methodical campaign to identify and claim what they considered stolen property, along with increasingly sophisticated efforts to pressure Willowbrook residents into selling their property at below-market prices. "The Beverly Morrison we met at the Carson Creek bank," Harper realized. "She's part of this family. They've been watching for anyone who might discover the trust, and when we showed up with Rose's key, they knew we'd found something significant." But the most disturbing document in the file was a legal memorandum dated just months before Rose's death, outlining a strategy for claiming the Willowbrook Trust through eminent domain proceedings. According to the memo, the Morrison family had identified a legal pathway that would allow them to force the sale of trust properties by claiming they were needed for essential infrastructure development. "They're not just after the money," Eli said, studying the legal strategy with growing alarm. "They want to complete the takeover that Jonathan prevented 70 years ago. Turn Willowbrook into the company town it was always supposed to be." The chamber's final revelation was a sealed envelope marked "For emergency use only sheriff's evidence." Inside was a complete copy of Jonathan Morrison's original investigation files, along with sworn statements from witnesses and financial documents that provided irrefutable proof of the corruption that had prompted the creation of the Willowbrook Trust. "She kept everything," Harper said, spreading the evidence across the chamber's central table. Every document Jonathan gathered, every piece of proof that the Morrison family committed crimes against this community. She was protecting not just the money, but the evidence that would expose the truth about what really happened. The evidence files revealed that Jonathan's investigation had been broader than either of them had realized. The railroad corruption in Willowbrook was part of a pattern that extended across multiple states, involving dozens of communities and millions of dollars in diverted funds. The Morrisons hadn't just been local criminals, they'd been part of a sophisticated network that had systematically exploited rural communities throughout the region. "This is why they've never stopped looking for the money," Eli realized. "If this evidence becomes public, it won't just expose what they did in Willowbrook. It'll reveal a pattern of criminal activity that could destroy their family's entire business empire." As they prepared to leave the chamber with Rose's carefully preserved evidence, Harper felt the weight of her grandmother's legacy settling over her like armor. Rose Quinn hadn't just been a woman who'd married for convenience and inherited a crumbling house. She'd been a law enforcement officer who'd spent her entire life fighting a war against corruption and exploitation. "She knew this day would come," Harper said, looking around the chamber one final time. "She knew that eventually, someone would have to stand up to the same forces she'd been fighting, and she made sure they'd have everything they needed to win." The sheriff's badge caught the light as Harper closed the display case, its tarnished surface reflecting decades of service and sacrifice. Soon, that badge would represent not just Rose Quinn's courage, but the courage of everyone who'd inherited her fight for justice. The clock tower's mechanism chimed the noon hour as they descended the spiral staircase, its bronze voice carrying across Willowbrook like a call to arms. The time for secrets and hidden preparations was ending, and the time for open conflict was about to begin. But now they had something their enemies couldn't anticipate: the truth about the past, the evidence to prove it, and the legal authority that came with understanding exactly what they were fighting for and why it mattered. Rose Quinn's final secret hadn't just been about money or property, it had been about justice and the courage required to claim it when the stakes were highest. The emergency town meeting that Mayor Janet Reeves called for that evening filled the community center beyond capacity. Word had spread through Willowbrook with the speed that only genuine crisis could generate, and residents who hadn't attended a public meeting in years found themselves crowding into folding chairs and standing along the walls. Harper and Eli sat in the front row, the evidence from Rose's hidden chamber secured in a briefcase that hadn't left Eli's side since their descent from the clock tower. Around them, familiar faces reflected the kind of concern that came from understanding that their community's future was about to be decided by forces beyond their immediate control. "Before we begin," Mayor Reeves announced, "I want everyone to understand the situation we're facing. This afternoon, I received official notice that Meridian Development Group has filed a petition with the county to condemn the clock tower as structurally unsound. They're claiming imminent public safety concerns that require emergency demolition procedures." The murmur that ran through the crowd carried undertones of anger and disbelief. Mrs. Patterson from the diner was the first to speak up, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd fed half the town for a quarter century. "That tower's been standing for over 100 years, she said, rising from her chair with the determined grace of a woman who'd never backed down from a fight. What imminent danger could there possibly be that wasn't there last week? Sheriff Tom Bradley stood to address the question, his expression grim. "Margaret, I've been in law enforcement for 30 years, and I've seen this pattern before. When outside developers want access to property they can't acquire legally, they find regulatory reasons to force access. The structural engineering report that Meridian submitted was prepared by a firm with no local presence and no previous experience with historical buildings." Eleanor Holloway raised her hand with the imperious bearing of someone who expected to be heard. "Sheriff Bradley, what exactly does this mean for those of us who've been living here peacefully for decades?" "It means that if the demolition petition is approved, Meridian will have legal authority to tear down the clock tower and excavate the foundation area for safety reasons. It also means that they'll have legitimate grounds to examine other historical properties in Willowbrook for similar structural concerns." The implication was clear to everyone in the room. The clock tower was just the beginning. Meridian's ultimate goal was comprehensive redevelopment that would transform Willowbrook into something entirely different from the community it had always been. Harper stood, feeling the weight of 3 generations of responsibility settling on her shoulders. "I have information that explains what's really happening here, and why it's essential that we protect not just the clock tower, but the legal rights that my grandmother spent her lifetime defending." She opened the briefcase and withdrew Rose's sheriff badge, holding it up so everyone in the room could see it clearly. The effect was immediate and profound. Several of the older residents gasped with recognition, while others leaned forward to get a better look at an artifact they'd never known existed. "My grandmother wasn't just Rose Quinn, the boarding house owner," Harper continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. "She was Sheriff Rose Quinn, elected to office in 1936 and tasked with investigating corruption that was systematically destroying communities like ours." Ed Mackenzie from the hardware store was the first to find his voice. "Rose was the sheriff, but we never had a female sheriff in Willowbrook County. According to the official records, she was appointed during a period when corruption had made it impossible for local men to effectively investigate crimes being committed against our community. She served for 16 years, and during that time, she uncovered evidence of a conspiracy that involved railroad officials, local politicians, and business leaders who were stealing municipal funds and forcing property sales. Harper withdrew Jonathan Morrison's investigation files, spreading selected documents across the table at the front of the room. These files document the theft of over $3 million from accounts that were supposed to benefit Willowbrook. They also show how my grandmother and a federal investigator named Jonathan Morrison worked together to recover that money and establish a legal trust to protect it. Dr. Patricia Vance stood to examine the documents more closely, her medical training having taught her to evaluate evidence with scientific precision. Harper, these papers appear to be original government documents. If they're authentic, they represent evidence of criminal activity that was never prosecuted. They're authentic, Eli confirmed, and they're just part of what Rose preserved in the clock tower's hidden chamber. She also kept detailed records of ongoing attempts by the Morrison family to reclaim what they consider stolen property, including recent legal strategies that explain exactly why Meridian Development Group is so interested in our town. Tommy Chen, the postal worker, raised his hand with the expression of someone connecting previously unrelated pieces of information. The Morrison family, are they related to the Railroad Morrisons? Because I've been delivering mail to a Beverly Morrison at the Carson Creek Bank for years, and she's been receiving correspondence from legal firms that specialize in property acquisition and eminent domain proceedings. Harper nodded grimly. Beverly Morrison is Jonathan Morrison's niece. Her family has spent 70 years trying to gain access to the money that my grandmother and Jonathan protected. And now they're using Meridian Development Group as a front for completing the takeover they originally planned. The room erupted in angry voices as residents began to understand the scope of the threat they were facing. This wasn't just about development or progress, it was about the continuation of a criminal conspiracy that had been targeting their community for generations. Mayor Reeves called for order, her voice cutting through the chaos with practiced authority. People, we need to focus on practical solutions. Harper, what you've shown us is disturbing, but what can we actually do about it? If the county approves Meridian's demolition petition, we'll lose access to the evidence in the clock tower. Harper exchanged glances with Eli, both of them understanding that the moment for careful strategy had passed and the time for decisive action had arrived. There's one more document that changes everything, she said, withdrawing the final piece of evidence from Rose's collection. The town's original charter, signed in 1892 and modified in 1936, had been preserved in the clock tower chamber along with the other critical documents. But this wasn't just a historical curiosity, it was a legal instrument that granted specific powers to elected officials during periods of demonstrated corruption or external threat. According to this charter, Harper explained, when evidence exists of systematic criminal activity targeting the community, the town council has the authority to assume emergency powers that supersede county and state jurisdiction. Sheriff Rose Quinn documented her use of these powers in 1936, and the precedent she established remains legally valid. Sheriff Bradley examined the charter with the careful attention of someone who understood the implications of emergency authority. Harper, if this document is legally sound, it means the current town council could invoke the same powers your grandmother used. We could block the demolition petition and launch our own investigation of Meridian's activities. More than that, Eli added, it means we could legally protect the trust assets and use them for their intended purpose, ensuring that Willowbrook remains economically independent and resistant to outside exploitation. The debate that followed was intense but brief. The evidence Harper had presented was compelling. The threat from Meridian was immediate, and the legal pathway Rose Quinn had established offered a clear course of action. When Mayor Reeves called for a vote to invoke the emergency powers specified in the town charter, the result was unanimous. This is a declaration of war. Dr. Vance observed as the meeting began to break up. Meridian won't accept this decision quietly, and they have resources we can't match in a conventional legal fight. Harper looked around the room at faces that reflected determination, concern, and the kind of quiet courage that came from people who decided to fight for something bigger than their individual interests. Then we'll have to make sure this isn't a conventional legal fight. We have something they don't, the truth, the law, and a community that's willing to stand together. As residents filed out of the community center, many stopped to examine the documents Harper had displayed, their expressions reflecting growing understanding of the stakes involved in the coming confrontation. These weren't just legal papers, they were proof that their community's struggles had deep historical roots and that the fight for independence was both older and more important than any of them had realized. The next morning brought news that confirmed everyone's worst fears about Meridian's intentions and resources. Sheriff Bradley arrived at the Victorian with legal documents that had been served on the town overnight, along with information about activities that suggested the coming conflict would test every aspect of their emergency preparations. "They've filed an injunction to block our emergency powers resolution," he reported, settling into the parlor with the weary expression of someone who'd been dealing with legal complications since dawn. "But that's not the worst of it. I've also received reports of unusual activity around the clock, tower surveyors, equipment operators, and what appears to be a private security team." Harper felt her stomach tighten. "How much time do we have?" "The injunction hearing is scheduled for tomorrow afternoon. If the county judge rules in Meridian's favor, they'll have legal authority to proceed with demolition as early as Friday morning." Eli moved to the window, observing the quiet street that seemed deceptively peaceful given the crisis brewing around them. "What about the evidence we found? Can't we use Jonathan's files to expose the corruption that started all of this?" "That's our best hope," Sheriff Bradley confirmed. "But we need more than historical documents. We need current evidence that connects the Morrison family to Meridian's activities, and we need it presented by someone with legal standing to challenge their claims." The solution came from an unexpected source. Mrs. Holloway appeared in the parlor doorway with the satisfied expression of someone who'd just solved a complex puzzle through the application of superior organization and long memory. "I've been thinking about Henry's legal files," she announced, settling into her favorite chair with the ceremony that significant pronouncements required. Specifically, about the documents he prepared for Rose regarding legal succession and emergency procedures. Harper looked up from the legal papers she'd been reviewing. "What kind of emergency procedures?" "Provisions for transferring law enforcement authority to qualified successors during periods of demonstrated corruption or external threat." Rose never officially resigned. As sheriff, she simply stepped back from active duty while maintaining legal authority for exactly this kind of situation. The implication was staggering. If Rose Quinn had retained sheriff's authority through proper legal channels, and if that authority could be transferred to Harper as her designated successor, then they would have law enforcement power that superseded both county jurisdiction and Meridian's legal maneuvering. "You're saying I could be appointed sheriff?" Harper asked, the possibility seeming both impossible and inevitable. "According to Henry's documentation, yes. The appointment would require confirmation by the town council, but given last night's unanimous vote, that shouldn't be a problem." Sheriff Bradley studied Mrs. Holloway with the respect due to someone who'd just provided a tactical advantage he hadn't anticipated. "Eleanor, if Harper is appointed sheriff with emergency authority, she could legally seize the evidence in Meridian's possession, investigate their activities under suspicion of criminal conspiracy, and protect the clock tower as a crime scene pending investigation." The emergency town council meeting that afternoon lasted less than 30 minutes. The appointment of Harper Quinn Turner as acting sheriff of Willowbrook, with full emergency powers and authority to investigate threats to community welfare, passed by unanimous consent. As Harper pinned her grandmother's badge to her shirt, she felt the weight of history and responsibility settling around her like inherited armor. The badge was more than just a symbol, it was a connection to Rose Quinn's courage and a reminder that some fights were worth whatever price they demanded. The hearing tomorrow will determine everything, Mayor Reeves said as the council meeting concluded. If the county judge upholds Meridian's injunction, we'll be in contempt of court for interfering with their demolition plans. If the judge recognizes your authority and our evidence, we'll have legal grounds to shut down their entire operation. That evening, as Harper and Eli prepared for what would either be their vindication or their defeat, they found themselves back in the clock tower's hidden chamber, reviewing every piece of evidence Rose had preserved and ensuring that nothing had been overlooked. She knew this day would come, Harper said, running her fingers over the careful documentation that had taken her grandmother decades to assemble. Every document preserved, every legal precedent established, every piece of evidence needed to fight this battle. Eli examined the financial records that showed the true scope of the Willowbrook Trust. $300 million, enough to guarantee that no family in this town ever loses their home to foreclosure again. Enough to ensure that local businesses can compete with corporate chains. Enough to build the kind of community that people choose to stay in rather than leave behind. The final preparation was personal. Harper wrote letters to Mia and Jake, explaining the situation in terms that 8- and 10-year-olds could understand, and making sure they knew that whatever happened in the coming days, they would always be protected and loved. Win or lose, she told Eli as they locked the clock tower chamber for what might be the final time. Those children are going to grow up in a community that stands for something. They're going to understand that sometimes ordinary people have to do extraordinary things to protect what matters most. The clock tower's bronze voice marked midnight as they walked home through Willowbrook's quiet streets, passing houses where families slept peacefully, unaware that their futures were about to be decided by a legal battle that had been brewing for nearly a century. In just over 12 hours, Harper would stand before a county judge and present evidence that could either validate her grandmother's lifetime of sacrifice or watch helplessly as decades of careful planning collapsed under the weight of superior legal, resources and political influence. But as she looked around at the community that Rose Quinn had died protecting, Harper felt something stronger than fear or uncertainty. She felt the quiet confidence that came from fighting for something worth fighting for, and the deep satisfaction of understanding that some legacies were too important to surrender without a battle. The sheriff's badge caught the streetlight as she walked, its tarnished surface reflecting not just her grandmother's courage, but the courage of everyone who'd chosen to stand with her when standing up was the only honorable option left. The county courthouse in Carson Creek had been built to intimidate, with marble columns, brass fixtures, and the kind of architectural grandeur designed to remind ordinary citizens that the law was both powerful and distant from their daily concerns. Harper walked up those imposing steps, wearing her grandmother's sheriff's badge and carrying a briefcase filled with evidence that could either vindicate decades of careful planning or mark the end of Willowbrook's independence. Judge Margaret Thornfield presided over the hearing with the careful neutrality of someone who understood that the decision she was about to make would have implications far beyond the immediate legal questions. She was a woman in her 70s, appointed to the bench during an era when female judges were rare, and her reputation for fairness was matched only by her intolerance for legal maneuvering that wasted the court's time. Meridian Development Group had arrived with a legal team that filled 2 entire rows of the courtroom. Their lead attorney, James Morrison III, was a man whose expensive suit and confident bearing spoke of someone accustomed to winning through superior resources rather than superior arguments. When he stood to present Meridian's case, his voice carried the practiced authority of someone who'd rarely been challenged by opposing counsel with equivalent credentials. "Your Honor," Morrison began, "this is a straightforward matter of public safety and municipal law. The structural engineering report we've submitted clearly demonstrates that the Willowbrook clock tower poses an imminent threat to public welfare. The town council's attempt to invoke emergency powers is nothing more than an emotional response to necessary development that will benefit the entire community." Morrison's presentation was polished, professionally prepared, and completely focused on technical issues that avoided any mention of the historical or financial complexities that had brought them to this moment. He spoke about foundation deterioration, structural instability, and the legal obligation of county authorities to protect citizens from dangerous buildings. When Harper rose to respond, she felt the weight of 3 generations of preparation guiding her words. Your Honor, with the court's permission, I'd like to present evidence that demonstrates this case is not about public safety or municipal development. It's about the continuation of criminal activity that has been targeting Willowbrook for nearly 90 years. Judge Thornfield's expression sharpened with interest. That's a serious allegation, Sheriff Turner. I assume you have documentation to support it. Harper opened her briefcase and withdrew Rose Quinn's carefully preserved files, along with Jonathan Morrison's original investigation materials. Your Honor, these documents were preserved by my grandmother, Sheriff Rose Quinn, who served Willowbrook County from 1936 to 1952. They detail a pattern of corruption involving railroad officials, local politicians, and the Morrison family that resulted in the theft of over $3 million from municipal accounts. The effect on James Morrison III was immediate and telling. His confident bearing faltered, and he exchanged urgent whispers with his associates while Harper continued her presentation. The money that was stolen from Willowbrook was never recovered through conventional legal channels because the corruption extended into state and federal government. Instead, it was protected through the establishment of the Willowbrook Trust, a legal entity designed to ensure that the funds would eventually be used for their intended purpose, protecting this community from exactly the kind of exploitation that Meridian Development Group represents. Judge Thornfield examined the documents Harper presented, her experienced eye quickly identifying the significance of official letterheads, government seals, and the kind of detailed financial records that couldn't be easily fabricated. Sheriff Turner, these appear to be authentic federal investigation files. Are you suggesting that Mr. Morrison's client is connected to the historical corruption you've described? Harper looked directly at James Morrison III, noting how his expensive suit and confident bearing now seemed more like armor than professional attire. Your Honor, I'm suggesting that James Morrison III is the great-grandson of the original Morrison who orchestrated the theft of Willowbrook's municipal funds. The current attempt to demolish the clock tower is part of a decades-long effort to gain access to evidence that would expose his family's criminal activities. The courtroom erupted in angry voices from Meridian's legal team, but Judge Thornfield's gavel restored order with the sharp authority of someone who'd presided over contentious cases for decades. Mr. Morrison, the judge said, her tone carrying new steel, I assume you have a response to these allegations. Morrison's reply was careful, professionally phrased, and completely avoided addressing the substance of Harper's accusations. Your Honor, these are historical documents of questionable relevance to the current case. Our concern is public safety, not family genealogy or alleged events from nearly a century ago. But Harper wasn't finished. She withdrew the final piece of evidence from her briefcasian ornate brass key that caught the courtroom's fluorescent lighting like captured sunlight. Your Honor, this is the final key that my grandmother and Jonathan Morrison referenced in their correspondence. It unlocks a safe deposit box at First National Bank of Carson Creek that contains evidence of ongoing criminal activity, including recent financial transactions that connect the Morrison family to Meridian Development Group's activities in Willowbrook. Judge Thornfield leaned forward with the expression of someone whose professional curiosity had been thoroughly engaged. Sheriff Turner, are you prepared to present this evidence to the court? I am, Your Honor. But I believe the court should also hear from Beverly Morrison, who manages the safety deposit box facilities at First National Bank, and who has been monitoring access to accounts related to the Willowbrook Trust. The revelation that Beverly Morrison, James Morrison III's cousin, had been using her position at the bank to gather intelligence about Harper's activities created exactly the kind of courtroom drama that Judge Thornfield had spent her career trying to avoid. but it also provided the court with a clear picture of the coordination between the Morrison family's business interests and their legal strategies. Your Honor, Harper continued, we request that the court issue a warrant for the immediate examination of the safety deposit box contents, along with an injunction preventing any demolition or excavation activities in Willowbrook, pending a full investigation of the criminal conspiracy we've documented. James Morrison III rose with the desperate energy of someone whose carefully prepared strategy had just collapsed. Your Honor, this is nothing more than a fishing expedition designed to delay legitimate development activities. There is no credible evidence of current criminal activity, and the court lacks jurisdiction over historical allegations that should have been addressed decades ago. But Judge Thornfield had seen enough evidence to understand that the issues before her court extended far beyond municipal development permits and structural engineering reports. Mr. Morrison, given the allegations that have been presented and the apparent family connections between your client and the historical events in question, this court believes that a thorough investigation is warranted before any irreversible actions are taken. The warrant was issued within the hour, and Sheriff Bradley accompanied Harper and court officials to First National Bank for the examination of the safety deposit box that had been waiting decades for this moment of revelation. The box contained exactly what Rose Quinn and Jonathan Morrison had promised: detailed financial records, correspondence, and legal documents that provided irrefutable proof of the connection between the Morrison family's current business activities and their historical criminal enterprises. But more importantly, it contained bank records showing that Beverly Morrison had been accessing Harper's account information and reporting her activities to Meridian Development Group, creating a clear pattern of ongoing criminal conspiracy that validated every allegation Harper had made. As they returned to the courthouse with the additional evidence, Harper felt the satisfaction that came from understanding that her grandmother's lifetime of careful planning had finally achieved its intended purpose. The truth was no longer hidden, the evidence was no longer vulnerable to destruction, and the legal authority to protect Willowbrook's independence was no longer in question. The final key had unlocked more than just a safety deposit box. It had unlocked the future that Rose Quinn had spent her entire life fighting to preserve. The courthouse steps where Harper emerged, victorious with the same marble steps where her grandmother had once stood as a young sheriff, facing down corruption with nothing but evidence, courage, and an unshakable belief that justice was worth fighting for. Now, 3 generations later, Harper carried that same belief along with legal documents that would transform not just Willowbrook's future, but the lives of everyone who called the town home. Judge Thornfield's final ruling had been comprehensive and unambiguous. Meridian Development Group's demolition petition was denied, their excavation permits were revoked, and their business activities in Willowbrook were suspended pending a full federal investigation of the criminal conspiracy allegations. More importantly, the court had validated the emergency powers that the town council had invoked, giving Harper the legal authority she needed to protect the trust and implement the community development plans that Rose Quinn had envisioned. James Morrison III and his legal team departed Carson Creek with the defeated bearing of people who'd discovered that money and political influence weren't always sufficient to overcome documented evidence and legitimate legal authority. Their expensive suits and confident demeanor had wilted under the weight of historical records that painted their family legacy in terms of theft, corruption, and decades of predatory behavior toward vulnerable communities. But Harper's victory was more than just legal. It was personal, emotional, and deeply connected to the kind of healing that communities experience when long-suppressed truths finally surface. As word of the court decision spread through Willowbrook, residents began to understand that their struggles with economic uncertainty and outside pressure hadn't been random misfortune, but the result of systematic exploitation that had finally been exposed and defeated. The celebration at the Victorian that evening brought together people who'd spent years living as neighbors without truly understanding how their individual stories connected to a larger narrative of resistance and protection. Mrs. Patterson from the diner arrived with platters of food that seemed to multiply as other residents contributed their own offerings. Ed Mackenzie brought tools and materials for the infrastructure improvements that the Trust could now fund openly. Dr. Vance carried medical supplies for the community health center that had been Rose Quinn's dream for 40 years. But it was the children who provided the evening's most meaningful moment. Mia and Jake, working with Mrs. Holloway's patient guidance, had spent the afternoon repairing a damaged family photograph they'd discovered in the clock tower. Shambera, formal portrait of Rose Quinn and Jonathan Morrison taken during their brief time together, before duty and danger had forced them apart. "We thought you might want this for the parlor," Jake said, presenting the restored photograph with the serious ceremony that significant gifts required. Mrs. Holloway showed us how to clean the glass and fix the frame, and Mia figured out how to make the torn parts fit back together. Harper accepted the photograph with hands that trembled slightly, not from nervousness but from the profound emotion that came with seeing her grandmother's face, looking back at her from a moment of pure happiness. In the photograph, Rose appeared young, confident, and deeply in love with the man whose investigation had started the chain of events that led to this evening's celebration. "They look happy," Mia observed with the straightforward honesty that children brought to emotional situations, like they knew they were doing something important together. Eli studied the photograph over Harper's shoulder, noting the way Rose and Jonathan stood close together with the easy intimacy of people who trusted each other completely. They were building something that would last longer than their own lives, something that would protect people they'd never meet. The restored photograph found its place on the parlor mantel, where it could watch over the activities that filled the Victorians' rooms with laughter, conversation, and the kind of purposeful energy that came from people who'd discovered they had the resources to transform their dreams into reality. Mayor Reeves arrived with preliminary plans for the infrastructure improvements that the Trust could now fund: openly road repairs, updated electrical systems, broadband internet access, and the small business development loans that would allow local entrepreneurs to compete with corporate chains. The plans represented more than just municipal improvements. They represented the kind of economic independence that protected communities from outside exploitation. Sheriff Bradley brought news that the federal investigation of the Morrison family's activities was expanding beyond Willowbrook to include similar patterns of corruption in communities throughout the region. "Turns out your grandmother and Jonathan weren't the only ones who recognized what was happening," he reported. "There are other communities, other families who've been fighting the same fight. Your victory here is going to help a lot of people reclaim what was stolen from them." But the evening's most profound moment came when Eleanor Holloway presented Harper with a letter that Henry had written shortly before his death, sealed and marked to be opened only after the Willowbrook Trust had been successfully claimed and protected. "My dear Harper," the letter began, "if you're reading this, it means that Rose's lifetime of sacrifice has finally achieved its intended purpose. You've claimed not just the money, but the responsibility that comes with it. You've discovered that your grandmother wasn't just a woman who owned a boarding house, but a sheriff who spent her career fighting corruption and protecting the vulnerable. What you may not yet understand is that this victory represents more than just the resolution of historical injustices. It represents the proof that ordinary people, working together with courage and determination, can defeat forces that seem impossibly powerful. The trust isn't just about money, it's about the idea that communities can control their own destiny if they're willing to fight for it. Rose always believed that someday someone would be brave enough to claim what she'd protected and wise enough to use it properly. She knew that person would understand that the real treasure wasn't the $300 million, but the opportunity to build something beautiful and lasting with resources that had been preserved for exactly that purpose. As Harper finished reading Henry's letter aloud, the parlor fell silent, except for the familiar sound of the clock tower marking another hour in Willowbrook's long history. But this time, the bronze chimes seemed to carry a different message, just the passage of time, but the promise that some achievements were worth the generations of effort required to accomplish them. The final surprise of the evening came from an unexpected source. Tommy Chen, the postal worker who'd spent years observing the comings and goings that shaped Willowbrook's daily life, approached Harper with the shy manner of someone who'd been waiting for the right moment to share important information. "Harper, there's something I should probably mention," he said, reaching into his mailbag with the careful ceremony that significant revelations required. "I've been holding on to this letter for 15 years, waiting for someone from the Quinn family to be in a position to handle what it contains." The letter was addressed in Rose Quinn's careful handwriting, for the granddaughter who inherits the fight, to be delivered when she proves worthy of the inheritance. Inside was a final message that provided perfect closure to the evening celebration. "My dearest Harper, if you're reading this, it means you've found the courage to claim what Jonathan and I protected for you. But more than that, it means you've found people who are willing to stand with you in the fight for something bigger than individual success. The money in the trust is yours to use as you see fit, but I hope you'll remember that the greatest wealth any community can possess is people who care enough about each other to make sacrifices for the common good. What you've accomplished tonight isn't the end of the story, it's the beginning. The resources you now control give you the power to ensure that Willowbrook remains a place where families can build lives, where children can grow up safely, and where neighbors take care of each other through whatever challenges the future might bring. Use this gift wisely, my dear granddaughter. Build something beautiful with it. And remember that every generation faces the choice between selfishness and service, between fear and courage, between standing alone and standing together. You've chosen well." The restored family portrait watched over the celebration from its place on the mantel, Rose Quinn's young face reflecting the same determination and hope that filled the parlor as Willowbrook's residents began planning the future they'd finally earned the right to control. The long fight was over, but the real work, the joyful work of building something beautiful and lasting, was just beginning. 6 months after the courthouse victory that had changed everything, Harper stood in the Victorians' restored parlor, watching autumn sunlight stream through windows that no longer rattled in their frames. The house that had once been crumbling under the weight of deferred maintenance now gleamed with the kind of careful restoration that honored its history while preparing it for another century of service. The transformation extended far beyond fresh paint and updated electrical systems. The Victorian had become the official headquarters of the Willowbrook Community Trust, its rooms bustling with the kind of purposeful activity that came from people who discovered they had the resources to turn dreams into reality. The parlor, where Harper and Eli had first discovered the hidden strongbox, now served as a meeting space where residents planned improvements that would benefit generations yet to come. Eli emerged from the basement workshop where he'd been installing a state-of-the-art security system to protect the historical documents that had become too precious to risk losing. His hands bore the honest calluses of work well done, but his eyes reflected the satisfaction that came from building something meaningful rather than simply making repairs. "The new vault is finished," he reported, settling beside Harper on the restored Victorian sofa that had witnessed 3 generations of Quinn family conversations. "Climate-controlled, fireproof, and secured with technology that would make a bank proud. Your grandmother's evidence will be safe for the next century." Through the parlor windows, they could see Main Street bustling with an energy that Willowbrook hadn't experienced in decades. The diner now served customers who came from neighboring counties to experience Margaret Patterson's famous hospitality. The bookstore had expanded into the adjacent building, creating a community center that hosted everything from children's reading programs to adult education classes. Even the old pharmacy building had been restored as a small business incubator, providing low-cost office space for entrepreneurs who were bringing new life to the local economy. The clock tower stood as a testament to the community's resilience, its bronze voice marking hours that now carried hope rather than mere endurance. The hidden chamber remained sealed, but its secrets had been transferred to the Victorians' new vault, where they would be preserved for future researchers who might need evidence of how ordinary people could triumph over seemingly impossible odds. "The children are home," Harper observed, watching Mia and Jake race up the front walk, with the boundless energy of young people who'd spent their day learning and playing in equal measure. Both children had flourished in the past months, their confidence growing alongside their understanding that they lived in a community where they were valued and protected. Mia burst through the front door with the dramatic flair that had become her trademark since discovering that she had a voice worth hearing. "Harper! Eli! You have to see what we built in the school garden today." Mrs. Patterson taught us how to plant winter vegetables, and Jake figured out a way to make the irrigation system work better. Jake followed with the more measured enthusiasm of someone who took engineering problems seriously. "We used the same principles that Eli showed us for the house's plumbing system. If you understand how water wants to flow, you can help it go where it needs to go without fighting against its natural patterns." Their excitement was infectious, and Harper felt the deep satisfaction that came from understanding that Rose Quinn's legacy lived not just in restored buildings and protected trust funds, but in children who were growing up with the confidence that came from being part of something larger than themselves. Mrs. Holloway appeared in the parlor doorway with the stately bearing that had made her the Victorians' unofficial hostess. At 78, she moved with the energy of someone who'd discovered that purpose was the best medicine for the aches and limitations that age inevitably brought. "Harper, dear," she announced, "you have visitors. Mayor Reeves and Dr. Vance are here for the monthly trust meeting, and Sheriff Bradley has some news about the federal investigation that I think you'll find quite encouraging." The monthly trust meetings had become Harper's favorite responsibility, bringing together the people who'd chosen to serve as stewards of the resources that could shape Willowbrook's future for generations. Each meeting balanced practical concerns, budget allocations, project timelines, community needs assessments with the larger vision that had motivated Rose Quinn's lifetime of sacrifice. Mayor Reeves arrived with reports that reflected 6 months of steady progress toward the goals that had once seemed impossibly ambitious. "The broadband infrastructure project is ahead of schedule and under budget," she announced, settling into the chair that had become her customary spot. "By spring, every home and business in Willowbrook will have access to high-speed internet that will allow people to work remotely while staying connected to the community they love." Dr. Vance brought medical updates that demonstrated how economic security could translate directly into improved health outcomes. The Community Health Center has served over 300 patients in its first 6 months of operation. "We're seeing people who postponed medical care for years because they couldn't afford it, and we're catching health problems before they become emergencies." The Trust's decision to provide health care as a community service rather than a business opportunity is literally saving lives. Sheriff Bradley's news about the federal investigation provided the satisfying closure that communities needed to fully heal from systematic exploitation. James Morrison III and 6 other family members have been indicted on charges ranging from fraud to conspiracy to commit racketeering. The investigation has recovered assets from 17 different communities, with total restitution exceeding $50 million. Your grandmother and Jonathan's evidence didn't just protect Willowbrook, it provided the foundation for justice that extends across 3 states. But the evening's most meaningful moment came when Harper withdrew the final document that completed the legal transformation of everything Rose Quinn had worked to accomplish. The new house deed, officially transferring ownership of the Victorian from Harper personally to the Willowbrook Community Trust, represented more than just a change in legal status. It represented the institutionalization of values that would guide the community's decisions long after the current generation had passed on. This deed ensures that the Victorian will always serve as the headquarters for community decision-making, Harper explained, signing the document with the fountain pen that had belonged to her grandmother. It can never be sold to outside developers, never be converted to purely private use, and never be separated from its role as a symbol of what ordinary people can accomplish when they work together. Eli signed as witness, his own name joining the historical record that connected Rose Quinn's original vision to its current fulfillment. Every generation will face the choice between serving themselves or serving something larger, he observed. This deed helps ensure that future generations will have both the resources and the institutional structure to make the right choice. As the meeting concluded and visitors prepared to return to their own homes, Harper walked through the Victorians' rooms with the satisfaction that came from understanding that every space now served its intended purpose. The parlor, where secrets had been hidden, now hosted open community discussions. The basement, where evidence had been stored, now contained workshops where residents learned skills that increased their economic independence. The upper floors, where boarders had once found temporary shelter, now housed permanent residents who'd committed to building their lives in Willowbrook. The restored family portrait watched over the evening's activities from its place of honor, Rose Quinn's young face, reflecting the same hope and determination that filled the house with purposeful energy. The photograph had become more than just a historical artifact. It was a reminder that love, properly channeled, could create institutions and resources that protected communities for generations. That night, as Harper and Eli sat on the front porch watching fireflies dance in the garden, where Mia and Jake had learned to trust each other and themselves, the clock tower's bronze voice marked midnight with deep, resonant chimes that carried across Willowbrook like a benediction. She knew, Harper said, understanding finally reaching the deepest levels of her heart. Grandmother knew that the money was just the beginning. The real treasure was creating something that would help people discover their own strength, their own capacity to build lives worth living. Eli's hand found hers in the darkness, fingers intertwining with the easy comfort of two people who'd learned to find strength in each other and in the community they'd chosen to serve. The children will grow up understanding that they live in a place where their dreams matter, where their neighbors will help them succeed, and where the work they do will benefit people they'll never meet. The Victorian settled into its bones with the contented sighs of a house that had finally achieved its purpose. In the morning, there would be more work to do, budgets to review, projects to plan, neighbors to help, and the endless small tasks that communities required to remain healthy and strong. But tonight, there was simply the deep satisfaction that came from understanding that some fights were worth the generations of effort required to win them, that some treasures grew more valuable when they were shared, and that the highest form of wealth was the knowledge that you'd helped create something beautiful and lasting with the gifts you'd been given. The clock tower's voice carried across Willowbrook one final time, its bronze tones marking not just another hour's passage, but another step forward in a story that would continue long after the current chapter had ended. Guided by the values and institutions that ordinary people had built through courage, sacrifice, and an unshakable belief that communities deserve to control their own destiny.